I am Christopher Smith, and this is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 82 of the Naked Mormonism podcast, the serial Mormon history podcast. Today is Thursday, December 21st, 2017. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. Today we jump into part 5 of our dive through Mormon polygamy. We're inviting a very special guest on, Lindsay Park of Year of Polygamy, as well as Sunstone, in order to help us address some of the modern-day concerns of fundamentalist sects and discuss kind of the broader concepts of polygamy in Mormonism. After that, we'll have on Ryan McKnight, our returning guest and correspondent from Mormon Leaks, to discuss some of the more prominent leaks that have come out through MormonLeaks.io. If you're a Patreon subscriber, be sure to check out the Patreon feed for a special extra episode that you get where Ryan and I discussed an op-ed that they released through the Salt Lake Tribune. Let's get into the episode. Let me just give a quick word of warning before we jump into the interview with Lindsay here. When she sent over her audio, it unfortunately picked up my audio track in it, and the audio was a little bit finicky and troublesome to edit, so I did my best to try and scrub it, but you're going to hear a couple of hiccups and bleeps and things that are coming through the Skype call that I really tried to work out of there, but I couldn't make it perfect. So if you are an audio connoisseur like myself and you're bugged by this, my sincerest apologies, but for the majority of people, hopefully this won't bother you too much. But stick in there with the fluctuating audio and whatnot because the content is really, really good. So right at the onset, my apologies. Let's dive into the interview. We have spent a lot of time breaking down Mormon polygamy. We've discussed various cultures and religions throughout history which have practiced some form of polygamy or polyamory in part 1. Part 2, we went through Joseph Smith's polygamy and discussed a bit about what the women were experiencing through their own writings, thanks to Todd Compton, of course. Then in part 3, we hit on Mormon polygamy post-1844 all the way up to the Brighamite 1890 Manifesto and all of the politics surrounding Utah and the federal government with relation to polygamy. In part 4, we dove into some of the more modern-day iterations, including the FLDS. Today, we're going to attempt a deeper dive into 20th century Mormon polygamy and get into the modern iterations of it. When it comes to the topic of polygamy, I am a mere fledgling child when it comes to the knowledge on the subject. So we're bringing on a returning guest expert who has been studying polygamy for years now to get her take on the subject. So please join me in welcoming Lindsay Park back to the show. Thank you so much for joining us, Lindsay. It's a pleasure to have you.
Hi, Bryce. Thanks for having me. I'm a little sick, so hopefully my voice doesn't reflect that.
Well, you sound wonderful to me, so let's try and get through it before anything bad happens here. I do have a few prepared questions that we have as a jump-off point for our discussion. But before we actually get started with those questions, I was wondering if there was anything particularly that you would like to preface this conversation with. You know, maybe something to put us in the right state of mind or to help kind of set the stage for our discussion today.
I do think it's important for people to understand that when we're talking about specific groups, that there are many groups. And one of the things that's frustrating for me to work with is when we're talking about fundamentalists, most people think of War and Justice Group, the FLDS, and I hear that conflated a lot. But there are actually over 400 extant groups of Mormonism, including the LDS Church. And I just want us to be careful that we don't, when we're talking about Warren Jeff's group, that we don't apply those stories and those theologies to all of the people.
Okay, very well said. And, I'll just briefly add to what you said there. I've spent a lot of time covering polygamy, and in this time discussing it, I've only been discussing what is instead of what ought to be, because I can't even try to understand the mindset of a lot of these people. So we're going to try and just stick with what is today instead of what ought to be. And maybe we'll briefly dive into what a perfect world of polygamy might look like. So Mormonism this is kind of a central point in operating system with Mormonism. It aggrandizes those who hold the priesthood. And it's subsequently moved and led by people who've largely been misogynistic with their ideology. I mean, there are, of course, a couple of progressive versions, but by and large, it is led by men with the priesthood. And Mormon history is written by men about men, and women seem to be only an addendum to the cause rather than an integral piece to the puzzle. So, Lindsay, you've really made some incredible efforts in feminizing the field of Mormon studies, or at least highlighting women's role in Mormon history, particularly when it comes to polygamy. So I want to ask, are there any women specifically that you would like to, kind of throw out there who played a major role in Mormon history, above and beyond just Mother Emma and Mother Lucy?
Yeah, there are actually a lot. And to use another prominent Mormon woman's term, Maxine Hanks always talks about excavating this history. We have to excavate it, which means, I like that framing because that means that we're not just discovering these women as if they just pop out of nowhere and haven't been there all along. The reality of Mormon history is women were there the entire time. They were involved the entire time. Mm-hmm. And those women are not talked about for a multitude of reasons. There are really prominent women like Bathsheba Smith and Emmeline Wells and Eliza Snow and Jane Manning James and Hannah Tapfield King. She's one of my favorites. So I would say, or, oh gosh, you asked me, I could keep going and going and going. Martha Hughes Cannon, she's one of my favorites. I mean, people don't know that the first female senator in the country was a Mormon woman, Martha Hughes Cannon. She was the plural wife of Angus Cannon, and he actually ran against her, and she won against her own husband. Yeah, she was amazing. She was so incredible, and she was a plural wife. So there are a long history of really incredible women, and women who were villains, women who were outlaws, like one of John D. Lee's wives, Anne Gorge. She's another favorite of mine. She writes these fantastical stories of riding with Billy the Kid and Geronimo, and most of it we think is made up, but yeah, it's fantastic. So there's just so many undervalued stories of incredible women.
That is, it's something that strikes me so heavily whenever I'm reading, subjects on Mormon history, articles or books on Mormon history, is they do focus essentially on the men because it is so, moved and led by the men. But it doesn't seem like we should just append women onto the end and say, oh yeah, the women were also there. And I know that, how women were treated, it seems like this was kind of the feminism Pt5 movement in the early 1840s and 50s. It seems like this was when they were saying, well, women's role is to raise up good sons who will vote with her best interests in mind. And that was not good enough for a lot of these women. And finally, in 1870, through a myriad of social pressures, women in Utah were given the right to vote. I find that profoundly fascinating.
Well, and of course, we know that this is all tied into polygamy. Without polygamy, suffrage didn't happen and probably wouldn't have happened as quickly. And most people don't know that polygamy and polygamous activists, who were Mormon women, who were very much activists at the time, got the vote passed through. They aligned themselves with famous suffragettes and the suffragettes, like some of the women from the East. We have Susan B. Anthony is in this famous photo with Emmeline Wells. They were uncomfortable aligning themselves with polygamous women, but they also realized that these women were smart and articulate, and they had a chance to get the vote, and they were right. And so the government thought if they gave Utah women the vote, they would vote themselves out of their own oppressions and vote against plural marriage, and they did not do that. So the government took the vote away, and Wyoming became the first official state, and then Utah got it back. But an interesting story.
It really is. And the way that it's so typically seen is that, you know, the women who are in polygamy, it's, I think, a common misconception that they are these timid, abused women who have, who have gone through an incredible struggle throughout their life. But while those examples may exist, by and large, a lot of polygamous women are very strong, powerful women who have had to forge life without a husband to support them, and without, the typical monogamy, relationship dynamic that we see so prevalent in society. And in that way, I feel like, both in early Mormon history as well as in modern day iterations, that has kind of served to empower a lot of these women and, force them to learn new skills and to be, leaders in the household when they don't have, a husband there to fill those roles.
I think you're exactly right. And I wish this is a framing that we would use more when talking about these women, because there's something dehumanizing when we talk about these women as if they're like these trapped animals, right, in the system. Mm-hmm. And we can talk about the abuses in the system in a minute. But in the same way that anyone in systems of oppression are resilient and find courage and find coping mechanisms and way to survive, Mormon women have always been doing this, and they still continue to do this amidst, different oppressions and challenges that they face. And so Mormon pioneer women on the frontier, settlers, were some of the toughest women that I've read about, along with, Native women on the plains that had to interact with those Mormon women, who Mormon women saw as degraded and lesser. Those women, too, found ways to, work within their systems and their challenges. And so I think if we start looking at people that way rather than as perpetual victims, it gives them a more dimensional, life.
Absolutely. Well, why don't we go ahead and explore the flip side of that? Because in a system like this, especially one that is so dominated by patriarchy, there are also abuses and harassment and sexual coercion that definitely happens in these instances. So, how do we kind of reconcile this? How do we deal with this, Lindsay?
It's not an easy question, and I still grapple with that myself. I think that there are lots of complicated stories. I think we have to be able to do the practice of holding two truths at once. It is true that women can be strong and resilient and victims at the same time, and I think that's hard for people to understand.
So one thing that I wanted to ask you about, you had an incredibly rare opportunity to interview a member of the FLDS, which have, historically been very hard to get a hold of in the media for myriad reasons. And that was episode 120 and 121 of Year of Polygamy. I kind of want to ask, what did you take away from those interactions and meeting these people face to face down in Short Creek?
Oh, wow. That's a big question. To even begin to answer that question, you have to understand the very fraught politics that the town is facing. So it's 2017, and I date that because in a year from now, the politics will be completely different. In a year from then, it will be completely different. Things happen so fast in that town, it's crazy. But at the time when I interviewed, we called her Mother Irene. That is not her name. Warren Jeffs has been in prison for a while, and his brother Lyle Jeffs has been running the group. And Lyle Jeffs was recently apprehended by authorities, and he is in trial right now, actually. And once he was gone, we have seen sort of a breakdown of the leadership. And because of that, the town of Colorado City is sort of falling to pieces. So it's mostly, the majority of the town now is run by ex-FLDS, people who have left the group and are trying to reclaim the town. But there are still right now probably about 8 families, plural families, living in the town, and that might sound small, but plural families are large.
Oh yeah.
it's a bunch of people, and they are trying to fight for their right to stay in the town, and that's a whole other complicated issue. But Mother Irene is one of the people fighting for the town. She is one of these strong women that I talked about. She's college educated. She has a master's degree in education. She's a teacher in the town. Her husband writes curriculum. They're not dumb people, and she's very smart. And some people in the town believe that she is there, called from the church on a PR mission. And other people say that there's not enough structure, that she's just doing it on her own. So yes, it is a rare opportunity, but I also think that we also have to keep in mind that they are navigating their own politics within the town. So it's likely that most of the faithful have been gathered to South Dakota already. And
Wow.
I got the sense talking to the families in town that they don't know that their church has left them behind. And they explain this with teary eyes as we drive by Warren's house that is now owned by apostates or ex-FLDS. They will cry when they see the home because they consider it a sacred place. And they will talk about how the windows of God are close to them right now, and they are being, tried and challenged because they are not hearing revelation. And so that is how they are experiencing it. It's sort of their own Missouri, if you will, and I think to some their own Nauvoo as they're being driven from their homes. And I think that that's the way that they are experiencing it. People in the town are experiencing it a different way because, of course, they see things in a different light. But so, a lot of the FLDS are breaking rules that they would normally not be allowed to do. So you can go in the town and you can see FLDS kids on the playground at the park, or sometimes rarely riding bikes. And if they were in good standing with their church, they would not be allowed to do that. That is not happening on the compound in South Dakota.
Wow.
And so we do think that there's a breakdown. So it is true that I had special access, and it's also true that I don't think anyone has access to the elite group, and that's terrifying to all of us that work in these communities because those people are so closed off and so isolated that they will not talk to you or I, and probably some of them will have gone for years and years, maybe their entire life, and not even left the compound.
One thing that I do want to focus on a little bit here is the reliance on isolationism that this group operates with, because this people, even in the Twin Cities, it sounds like the leadership has diminishing control in this area, but still they don't access the internet. They don't consume any media. They see a completely different Warren Jeffs and a leadership than we do. We have completely different views on reality. What do you make of that? I mean, how are we supposed to reconcile this? I feel like I wish there was some way that we could educate them, or, I wish that I could give them my eyes for just a second so they can see the world through my eyes and see their own situation through my eyes. But it's never that simple. But they do rely on being isolated in order to continue operation, especially in this South Dakota compound. Is there any kind of anything that's, I don't know, I'm kind of lost. Is there anything that we can do?
So this is going to be a long answer to your question, but I think the very first thing we can do is integrate ourselves into their life. So we stigmatize and other fundamentalists. We treat them differently. We think that they're foolish and strange and crazy. And some of us, if you grew up LDS, should know what that feels like a little bit. Maybe some of you have experienced religious persecution. In my case, I was a religious persecutor because I was in a predominantly LDS town and, treated people who weren't LDS pretty poorly.
Yeah.
In their case, some of the worst treatment that the FLDS have ever received have been from the LDS. And you can ask most fundamentalists and they will say the same thing. LDS people want them to stay in their lane. They want them to change their names. They want them to change their doctrine and separate themselves completely. And I think that has more to do with LDS institutional memory and shame than what the groups are actually doing. So one of the very first things that we can do is start to treat and talk about them as people and understand that they are really, truly no different. Their brains are not different than ours. They would work the same if they grew up in our household, and we would think the same if we grew up in theirs. And they are also perfectly capable of understanding many, many things. So integration is my main goal. I try to get people to go down to Short Creek as often as possible. If you're near South Dakota, you will not be able to get on the compound in Pringle, But if you see people in your community, make an effort to talk to them, make an effort to reach out to them, even though they will not talk back to you. It is something that has to happen. Outsiders are seen as dangerous and very, very threatening. They're told that some of us will rape and kill them on the spot. And that's terrifying to believe. So we have to integrate. That's my main goal. I think that if we don't integrate, Warren Jeffs gets power by saying, you know, you can't trust the evil outsiders. Another one that is more controversial, and I'll let people with more legal expertise debate me on this, but I think we need to decriminalize polygamy because as long as it's criminal, it allows people like Warren Jeffs and other group leaders to say, don't go to the police if you're being domestically abused. Don't go to the police if you're being molested, because then your whole family can go to jail. Which, of course, as far as I know, has never happened. But it's a very real threat. And there are reasonable minds that disagree with me. I know some great anti-polygamy activists who worked really hard to get the law recriminalized this year in Utah. And I respect and honor what they have done because they are victims of polygamy. These are women who have actually lived it, know what it's like to live under it, and do not think it's a healthy system. And I also support and champion them in their work. I want the same things that they do. I just see that plural marriage is going to happen no matter what we do. It's happening. It's been illegal for a century, and that doesn't stop people. And this is why I've moved away from the legalization argument too, because polygamists are not going to seek out marriage certificates. They're still going to do their private sealings.
Yeah.
So I'm for decriminalization. I think that we need to allow people to not be scared about their lifestyle so they can access, healthy resources. And then the third thing I would say is I just try to understand the situation. Try not to judge these people. So you talked about the internet and things like that, and that is absolutely true. The FLDS is very cut off from the outside world. But what I wish people would know is that before the year 2000, the group wasn't like this. Rulon Jeffs was in charge. He actually grew up in the mainstream LDS church. He married Hugh B. Brown's daughter, Zola, and was on his way up the LDS hierarchy. And then what happened was he converted very quickly to fundamentalism and continued to sort of bring the FLDS to look more like the modern LDS church. He correlated things. He changed a lot of things. A lot of people don't know that their chapel in Colorado City, the inside looks just like the tabernacle downtown. So things like that. And it was just this idyllic little town for a long time. And Rulon had families all over Salt Lake City. So a lot of people like myself, we grew up seeing polygamists all over. Sometimes people played with them as neighbors. And it wasn't until the Olympics came to Utah in 2002 that Rulon gathered everybody down to Short Creek, which is the towns of Hilldale, Utah, and Colorado City, Arizona, with a revelation that the world was going to end and be destroyed. So everybody gathered, and of course it didn't happen, and like you do when you have a failed prophecy, you blame it on the faithfulness of the people, which he did. Somebody out there has masturbated. That's not what he said, but...
Yeah, but that's what it was implied anyway.
Exactly. Yep. So they had to all go back and be like, which one? And of course everybody's like, oh no, it was me.
Yep.
So that's how these systems work. So then they started to become really isolated, but also Rulon's health deteriorated quite quickly. Most people in the town think that Warren Jeffs was poisoning his father with clay, red clay, which can be used as a medicine, but that he was giving him too much. I mean, there's no proof of this, but it's not unlikely. Warren started to take control over his father and his father's wives, and pretty soon Warren finds himself in power through a pretty miraculous story where he claims to take on the mantle of his father as Brigham took on the mantle of Joseph Smith. Rulon Jeffs even presides at his own funeral. So,
well, interesting. Okay.
From there, Warren starts ranking up the crazy. This is where he starts instituting more and more and more rules. This is where we see the pastel prairie dresses, women and the hair braids and the bumps and the no TVs. One year they got rid of all the TVs and you could drive down, southern Utah and see on the side of the road piles and piles of electronic equipment.
Wow.
And, of course, this didn't extend to the leadership, because what they did is install cameras in most homes and in the church. And they actually had, you can talk to security guards there. The level of security in the chapel, they could zoom in on individual congregants' faces to see how they reacted to certain sermons.
Wow. Very, 1984. I mean, it's very draconian and terrifying, Orwellian, and it's deeply intertwined with the religious leaders. I mean, the religious leaders are the one perpetuating this, and at this point, they are serving as the intermediaries between the people and the government, and they are controlling the information that goes in and out to and from these people. I mean, I can understand how they could manufacture in these people's minds a situation that made them think like the apocalypse is coming, because when you can have that much control, you can program anything into somebody's mind. Yeah,
that's exactly it. And Warren's instituted something else that I don't think people know a lot about, which are weekly confessions. So imagine having a church leader that really basically turns your church to an OCD religion, right? Like, he gives out these forms and journals, and I've seen them, and people had to take daily inventory of their things that they owned. And I'm talking like a 10-minute to 10-minute journal of what they do each day with their time.
Wow.
And so they were asked to do that and turn that in. And at the end of the week, they had to send their confession letters to their bishops. So people are confessing all the time of whatever sins. And when you confess that much, you start, honestly, running out of things to say, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So people start fibbing, or they start talking about their neighbor. Actually, I heard my neighbor did this. So it's funny, like I was talking to Roy Jeff, so I think you interviewed, and we were joking about this, and he was like, yeah, I just thought my dad had the spirit of discernment because he's supposed to know all my sins. And then I realized I'm writing him my sins every week.
Yep.
So that's part of it. But at the same time, the FLDS they own a lot of companies, a lot of construction companies, some aerospace companies, some machinery companies. They own a lot of land. People don't realize that even though the people are poor, they have some big companies. Jack Daniels Construction is one of them. I'm trying to remember the name. I could list them all. There's a whole bunch. But they also have farms, and they, have a lot of cheap and free labor. There's actually a case in the court right now about child labor with their pecan farms, having the children pick the pecans. So, all of this stuff is going on, and it's happening slow enough that people are going for it. So good people who lived in the town before now all of a sudden have a different dynamic, and now all of a sudden their holidays are gone, and now it's seen as evil to celebrate any holidays, and now birthdays are no longer celebrated, and now we're changing the colors of clothes, and now we're getting rid of certain foods you can't eat, and eventually, which we can talk about where they're at now, he gets rid of marriages completely.
Wow. So, I mean, just a total and complete control in the hands of the very uppermost elites.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say just the uppermost elites. I mean, I would say it was Warren Jeffs, and if anything, maybe his brothers.
Okay, so one thing about criminalizing polygamy is it seems to galvanize people. The people who are in the lifestyle, it seems to just make them feel like they are being persecuted by the government. But by and large, any actions that the government is taking against these groups is because they are violating some law. And one thing that I wanted to kind of hone in on here that has served to be a major catalyst for confusion and persecution complexes is the United Effort Plan. Do you mind telling us a little bit about what happened with the United Effort Plan and kind of what's going on with that whole situation?
Yeah, so the United Effort Plan, or the UEP, was started out as a united order, and I believe, it's been a while since I researched the history exactly, but I believe it was in the 70s when they actually get it legally incorporated. So they had been all forms of polygamous communities and many Mormon communities like the LDS. We still practice some sort of form of the Order of Enoch or the United Order. And, in the LDS Church, I would say it is our fast offerings and the way we tithe and things like that. All things for the common good. So the United Effort Plan was the FLDS's way to do this. And so they set up a trust, and there's some legalities with how they set up the trust, but the way that they set up the trust meant that if they were out of line with the regulations of the trust, that the government could step in and seize their property, which was their mistake.
Yeah, absolutely.
What they did is, for years, they were operating the trust, and when Warren, and it seemed to be, in ways that were mostly fair, Rulon had sent a few people away from the community, but for the most part, it seems like that was pretty rare and people got along. And when Warren took over, he started doing things like having people deed over all their homes, all their property, all their family. And that sounds strange, but when you are FLDS and you don't have any outside resources, you don't know that your children belong to you. You think they belong to the church. You think your wives belong to the church. You think everything belongs to the church. So that is how it was talked about. Everything belongs to the church. It's all for the common good. And so everybody worked for the UEP. You worked for free a lot, and your resources went into the UEP. And then if you were righteous, you would get to eat from the bishop's storehouse. They call that the United Order group. That's the highest level. And if you were in the repentance group, which is the lowest level, there's, some stuff in between. But if you're in the repentance group, you don't get to eat from the bishop's storehouse. Or at one time, I believe they had a separate storehouse they were feeding those in the repentance group. So you sort of want to work your way back in. And what had happened was, by the 1990s, most people had deeded over their property. A few people refused and kept their private ownership of the land. When the government got word of this, so what Warren would do is he would send people away they would confess for something or confess about their neighbor, and then at Warren's whim, or at Lyle, his brother's whim, they would send people away, and they would have to give up their home and their family. And how that would happen is...
Well, hang on. Send people away. Is that like excommunicating them or sending them to a different place that's, a different community that's FLDS?
Okay, so it's both, but we would understand it as excommunication.
Okay.
Rebaptism is very common in the FLDS. You could get rebaptized many times. I know a woman who got rebaptized at least 12 times for her sins. That's not unique to Mormonism. That's not just an FLDS thing. Brigham Young was doing that, but rebaptism is sort of a way to reconsecrate yourself. Sending away functions in the same way that Joseph Smith might excommunicate someone. You can be sent away or excommunicated and work your way back. And so what would typically happen with Warren is you would be called into the office. He would discern that you had done a sin. So there's a woman named Sarah who I'm going to, interview and tell her story, but she was sent away for murder. And murder is miscarriage. She had a miscarriage.
Wow.
Sorry. She was accused of having a miscarriage, which they see as murder. And she claimed she wasn't even pregnant, but someone had turned her in. So they gave her 2 hours. She wasn't allowed to talk to her children, her 6 children, or her spouse. She was allowed to go home in the dark, get her things, and they took her in a van and dropped her off in North Carolina at a gas station. Just dropped her off. The idea was she has a year to work on it and get back in good standing in the church. And so, most women that are in this situation, they find a trucker and hook up with a trucker to survive, and they don't know birth control, so many of them get pregnant. That's an issue that's been happening. But these women are surviving the best way they know how, and it takes them about a year to realize, wait a minute, I'm never getting back in the good graces of the church. This isn't working. And I have a legal right to my kids. I never knew that. And so there's a great lawyer. If you want to support the efforts of someone, his name is Roger Hoole, and he works for this community pro bono in reuniting these mothers with their children. And I got to go on 2 of these trips where we've reunited families, and it is very, very intense. Because the children, in the absence of their parents, are taught that to save their own souls and to save the souls of their siblings and of their parents, they can never accept their parents back in. I cannot explain to you how ingrained that is to these children. So when Sarah was able to successfully get her 6 children back for, I want to say the first 8 months, they were keying her car, they were trying to run away, they were rubbing feces on the wall, they were just damaging things. Anything they could do to get back. It took a long, long time for them. It's really, really a struggle. So, they're sending a lot of people away. And sometimes, very rarely, I've heard of cases of where men were sent away and came back. But when they were, their families have been reassigned to someone else.
Wow.
One of the first men is a friend of mine. His name is John, and John was one of the first men to be sent away and have his wife reassigned to another family. And I can't explain to you the trauma. I don't think I can even understand the trauma myself of what that does to someone.
Of course.
But Warren has done that to many, 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 many people. And so when the government got word of this, they said, not okay. So they stepped in, they seized the trust, they put a Mormon LDS man named Bruce Wiesen in charge of it. He's a lawyer, and he ran the trust. And when this happened, when the FLDS knew that the trust was being seized, what they started to try to do is sell off as much of the FLDS land to private buyers as possible. And so Willie Jessup was a loyal follower of Warren's, and he had a lot of money, and he bought a lot of the property in his name. So a lot of land is owned by him. There's some few powerful men that were in the LDS or the FLDS hierarchy who now own a lot of private land. But the majority of the land that is still owned by the trust have, homes and businesses and properties on it. And so the trust said, we can let you keep your home, but you have to pay $100 rent and you have to pay your property taxes.
But I can understand also the people who are a member of the community having the trust, the United Effort Plan, or UAP, controlled by an infidel, a member of the LDS Church that they see as completely heretical to the FLDS, the fundamentals of Mormonism. I can see how that might also forward the persecution complex as well. It's a very confusing kind of web of chaos that Warren has spun for everybody.
And that's exactly it. And part of it is people were resentful about the trust. I mean, you have to understand that these homes are homes that the community built together. I mean, you can walk through with anyone in the town, and I'm not kidding. You can say, hey, who built that house? And they all know. And part of them, were there, or my grandfather lived in that house. The history there is very, very important to them. And so this was no small thing. They experienced this as a persecution. But from the government standpoint, they were asking something very reasonable. They were saying $100 a month and property taxes, not bad. But from the FLDS perspective, they're like, we haven't had to pay rent, and this is BS, Mm-hmm. What complicated it was FLDS do not consider LDS apostates. They consider us Gentiles. They think that we have strayed long enough, for generations enough, from the true doctrine of the gospel that we are no longer accountable for the sins of our fathers, right? For Adam's transgressions. So we are Gentiles. But people that leave the FLDS church are apostates. And by religious law, they are not allowed to talk with or interact with apostates. I mean, think of institutionalized shunning. So what happens is that after a year or so, the trust turns over the UEP to local leadership, because now at this point we have, and this is the part that I've been involved with in the last 5 years, we have a city council being formed. We have government leaders. We have people coming back in the town trying to, establish ordinances and permits and laws like regular cities. And so the government turns it over to local leadership, which in some ways I think is really, really smart, because those people understand the histories of the home. And so what would happen is, if you're sent away and you come back and you want a home, you will be assigned a home. And now it might not be the one that you built or that you were living in before, but at least you're promised a home.
Okay.
So people are all just spread out all over. Well, once they did that, it made it nearly impossible for the folks who were FLDS to pay their rent, because they had to pay to apostates. So that $100 fee now becomes this huge sticking point, because by religious law, they're not allowed to pay it. They're not allowed to give money to apostates. And because of that, the UEP's fiduciary responsibilities requires them to boot people, to kick them out. So people are being evicted from their homes, and they see this as their nauvoo. You can see tapes on Christine Caddis's wall. She films these evictions, and it's very harrowing. It's grandmothers crying in the snow as they're being forced out of their homes, and children crying as they're carrying their stuff. And, It's a really hard struggle. And from the UEP's perspective, they're like, just pay your bills. And from the FLDS perspective, they feel like they've been set up to be kicked out. And I think that there might be truth to both sides of that. I do think that ex-FLDS are angry in the way that ex-Mormons can sometimes be, and they want to see them suffer. They want to see them gone. They want to see them out of there. So it's tricky.
But hang on, let me just take issue with that really quickly. Is it that they want to see the people themselves suffer, or they want to hurt the religion, and the only way that they can do that is by, making people or removing people from the community?
I mean, honestly, I think it's both in this particular situation.
Okay.
I mean, we have to understand that this system that Warren set up is so crazy confusing that he's allowed people to damage each other in ways that I don't think we can ever grasp or comprehend. And I know I'm not articulating that very well, but let me put it like this. I grew up in a very Mormon-centric place in Utah. In our ward, it was just our little block of neighborhood. It was perfectly concise. So I knew everybody in my neighborhood, every single family, and I knew who was Mormon and who wasn't. And it was like being in that tight-knit community and having the leadership go teach doctrine to your neighbor that they're not teaching you. And so you guys are operating from completely different understandings. And they're telling other neighbors one thing and telling you something else. Having you spy on your neighbors, so people, there's a lot of distrust, there's a lot of resentment down there. That's part of the problem. And I also think that most people are angry at the religion, and a lot of them love the people that are being evicted. A lot of them, that's their family members. And I think that they have that desire that a lot of people who leave religion do, is they want their family members to wake up, Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes they think that this tough love will do that. Unfortunately, in my experience, it seems to be the opposite. It seems to drive them further into their fundamentalism because they feel persecuted. But it's complicated.
I want to dive into a bit of this is kind of a tough subject that we've touched on a little bit when it comes to polygamy and the power dynamic that's created in particularly polygynist communities, and it's consent and education. And this is kind of where I personally take issue with these groups, because Mormonism has created this culture where the accepted norm is a male-centric power dynamic, and women are beholden to their husbands in order to attain salvation, to get to heaven. So when a man tells his wife that, hey, I need to take another wife so that we can get into the celestial kingdom, the decision falls on that first wife to decide whether or not that family is getting into heaven. And there's this inherent coercive force underlining these interactions. So how is it, is it even possible to separate out educated and consensual relationship dynamics with, the religious aspects so deeply intertwined in this decision-making process?
I think that's a really good question, and I wish that would be the way that people would frame the discussion a little bit more, because I think that it adds this complicated layer to it, which it is complicated. The short answer to your question is no. I know very, very, very few polygamous relationships that I would deem to be consensual.
Okay.
That said, I do believe that they exist. And that said, I think we do danger if we start to impose what we think is consent or not. But from my experience, it seems that most of these decisions were made sometimes, if you're FLDS, under duress and force.
Yeah.
But
very much so.
It's just like the system you grew up in, and that's the way of life that you chose. And so I would equate it to, let's ask this question to LDS people. If you're an LDS male and you're 19, did you choose to go on a mission? And I want you to think of how your mind would process that question. And I think it's similar to process that for a lot of these polygamous women. Of course they can say no. Of course they don't have to do it. Some do say no, but very, very rarely. And when they do, there are social stigmas and consequences attached to that.
Of course.
To me, that's coercive. I mean, it is. I just don't think that there's a way around it. But it also, when I say coercive, I can see my fundamentalist friends' faces that they see faith as the informed part of informed consent, if that makes sense. They think that their faith informs them and compels them to do that.
But, from an objective, well, I shouldn't say objective because I'm anything but objective, but from an objective outsider's viewpoint, I would argue that they are not whatsoever educated in this situation. And they're not informed by any standard that we would consider informed in, a public court or anything to that effect. So even that is just really hard, a threshold to cross.
Actually, okay, so I would actually push back on that and disagree with you. I think that they actually are way more informed about plural marriage than we are. I mean, they grow up in the system, they know what it entails. If you brought an LDS woman and forced her into a polygamous marriage, I would argue your point. But a lot of these people know what they're getting into. How I would better frame that is to say, I don't believe a choice is a choice if you've never seen anything different and don't know any different.
Exactly.
And, I, as an LDS person, got married very, very young. I chose to do so. I didn't have to do so. And yet I still have some resentment in how that process worked. I feel like I was not, my parents would have been supportive if I didn't get married young. In fact, I think they would have liked me to wait. But to me, how it felt was the damage was already done. By the time I was 18 and 19 and somebody asked me, the damage was done. I had years and years and years of sort of this grooming, might be a trigger word for people.
I would say like pigeonholing more than grooming.
Yeah, I mean, like conditioning, that's probably a loaded word too.
That's better.
But you know what I mean? It's just like my whole worldview was directed here. I'd had hundreds of lessons of can't wait to be taken to the temple, and now here's an opportunity to do that, and so I took it. And so I think it's like that with the extra stigma and social pressure. And if you're dealing with communities with only under 1,000 people or something, then the pressure is even more amplified because everybody knows your business.
Of course. I mean, they built your house for you. They know everything about you.
And you're taught that outsiders don't understand, and you know that outsiders don't understand. And this is the one thing that I could also, answer your question about what we can do. If we talk about polygamy irresponsibly publicly, I think that it can sometimes do damage and distance ourselves from helping people like this.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's why largely members of the FLDS have been opposed to media because they feel like they have been completely misrepresented by the mainstream media when they do make appearances. So I can understand why they might be a little bit gun shy when it comes to, doing interviews with people and even just talking to somebody who's an outsider on just walking down the street in the Twin Cities.
Yeah, and this is actually a huge problem, and it's one that I struggle with too because, I love journalism. I think that there are amazing journalists out there. I support good journalism, and I hate to get like all Trump and fake news, but I have also witnessed many, many, many times where news have misrepresented or sensationalized things. For example, I probably get, no joke, a press request a week. And when it first started happening, it was so flattering. It's like, oh, the BBC wants to talk to me, But now I just ignore a lot of them because what happens is it's the same old shtick every time. It's some production company that contacts you and says, hey, we're doing this story and we want to tell it differently this time. And we want to tell about a modern plural family. And every single time the story is told the same. And I think that the story that we hear about the FLDS is this guns and, hero and villain, black hat, white hat, cowboy, goes in, rescues the town from the evil Warren Jeffs, and the poor victim women. Like, that is certainly an element to the story. It does not capture what is really happening, and it does not capture the experiences of the people, and so they feel really burned. And press have exploited these people. I mean, I have seen some things that are unethical. And so I'm really cautious about just even how much press is down there. Sometimes it's very predatory. A lot of times it's very predatory. And I would say the same things about some help organizations. There's a lot of organizations down there trying to rescue people from their Mormonism. I've seen, good intentions be sort of predatory, and that's hard to watch.
And one thing that I have come to really understand in, studying this, particularly the modern day iterations, is there may be villains, but there really aren't heroes in these situations. There is not just good people and, good guys and bad guys. This is a highly nuanced situation. The leadership, particularly of the FLDS, Warren Jeffs and his elite, have taken some certain actions that they may have considered righteous, or that they may have considered the right thing to do at a given time, that has completely destroyed the lives of people in so many ways. And those people are just, trying to survive from day to day, but they feel persecuted by the government, but the government is still trying to deal with the FLDS with kid gloves, because anytime that they've taken the gloves off before, it has been an absolute nightmare and a PR mess for the government and for the FLDS. And it's only galvanized the people in their persecution even more. And there's just no simplicity to it. There's no simple perspective to take with it. Even if we do get into a discussion about whether it's best to legalize or to continue a prohibition on polygamy, even that is rife with, questions and complexity with the best way to approach this from a legal perspective. I mean, there's just simply no way to approach this subject and keep it simple.
You're exactly right. And I think no matter what we do, somebody will suffer.
Yeah.
All the people involved that are doing good work here, I think, are considering that suffering, but there's not a good answer. And I think, this one has been very hard for me, particularly because Warren Jeffs is someone I've advocated a little bit of understanding for and compassion for, because he was a victim of the system, right? He was a kid who grew up with his own abuses and his own demons and his own shame. And I really do believe that shame that became unchecked sort of turned him into what he is. And yet at the same time, I'll just tell you, I advocate for not looking at anyone down there as black and white, including Warren. But then just last night, I was leaked some documents that will be coming out in the public in the next little bit. And it's some of the things that Warren has done that are probably the darkest things I've ever read. And
wow.
It was a very difficult night for me yesterday to see this and to understand the scope of what I'm dealing with. And I think it's abuse that I could have never even entertained or imagined. And I think about that, and I think about the times when I've, asked for people to not look at him as black and white. And this really challenges me, because when I read it, I want to say he is evil. No excuse. And I don't have a good answer for that right now, and probably because it's still too raw. But I do think that if we want health in these communities, we do have to try to walk our rhetoric back from a cliff. Again, if you go in and you're like, let me rescue you from polygamy, or polygamy is the problem. If you grew up with 5 moms that you love, who were all kind to you, that you value, you're not going to see polygamy as the problem. You're going to see other things as a problem. You're going to see patriarchal abuse, or obedience to a leader, or maybe something that your bishop did, but you're not going to see polygamy as a problem. And so the way that we talk about this is incomplete. And sometimes I think that this is the problem with helping people from this community is we want them, and I'm talking specifically about the FLDS community, if they're out, we want to all talk about their childhood and their group as if carte blanche is terrible. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry you came from such a horrible place. And we want them, whether we realize it or not, to reject their entire identity, because we see it as so abhorrent. But what I've learned in working with this community and these people, that it is not fair, nor is it my right, to ask anyone to give up the things that made them who they are. And it is also not fair or accurate to say that their entire childhood was gross or wicked or bad. I mean, that's just not true. People find happiness everywhere. And so I'm finding that allowing people to claim their identity in the way that they want is healing to them. And I would extend, that's sort of the work that I do in the LDS community too. I ask people to claim the Mormon parts that made them who they are, for good or ill. And I find that is a healthier way to engage, rather than to just expect them to be like, it's all agreed upon that the FLDS are terrible and you're glad you got out of that. That's not a helpful way to frame it for people.
One thing that I find so very complicated with all of this is just the religious aspect of it, because say what you will about Warren Jeffs, whatever he has done, he likely believes in his heart of hearts that what he's doing is righteous in the eyes of God. And he's using his upbringing, his childhood, his entire understanding of the essence of whatever his personal God is in order to justify what he feels is a justifiable deed. And in that vein, he is the prophet of the church. He is the one person that they look to as their leader. And these people follow their religious belief. They follow their prophet because he knows the way. And when you kind of try and well, I should say there's no way to disassociate this person's religious beliefs from their actions that they're taking. I don't think that Warren Jeffs is a nihilist, atheist who is just plotting, how can I get more money out of this situation? I do not think that at all. I think he's very sincere in his beliefs, and though that sincere religious beliefs happens to lead him to do some unconscionable things that we might consider something that a comic book villain might do or something. So, and it seems to be kind of a similar theme running through a number of the prophets. I think Brigham Young does hold a lot of very similar tendencies in that way, just from what I know of Brigham Young. And the people who serve under them, the people who comprise the entire pyramid that these religious leaders sit on top of, they kind of suffer the consequences of what these people think and believe as their sincerely held religious belief. And, it's really hard to try and parse this out. So I kind of I want to leave this off with a large and probably an unanswerable question. Lindsay, do you see any logical end to particularly the misogynistic practices of Mormon polygamy anytime in the near future? If so, what does that look like? Or if not, why, and should we even work towards trying to educate people out of this misogynistic fundamentalism?
Okay, that's a great question. I do want to speak to something about Warren Jeffs really quick, like you said. I know in myself, we were talking about a few years ago about gratitude on Thanksgiving. People were saying what they were thankful for. And at the time I was in therapy, and my therapist was asking me to reflect on what I was feeling as I said something. So I was doing this. I was like, I feel grateful for food on my table. I feel grateful for my family. And as I'm feeling this, I realize the feeling I'm feeling in my gut is fear. And it kind of blows my mind. I'm like, oh my gosh, I experience gratitude as fear. Like, I don't even know what actual gratitude is. And as I started to do this process, I realized that a lot of the things that I felt as the spirit or my connection with God were actually feelings of shame. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but I realized that any time that I felt I had a personal spiritual experience, like I was praying and I felt God heard me, is normally because I felt shame and I felt forgiven, or I felt like I wasn't worthy. And so I really realized that I had built my paradigm of God with fear and shame. My theory with Warren Jeffs is that he probably did something similar. I think that Warren has some desires and inclinations that he feels shame and fear about. And I think that Warren has made a God in that image, a God of shame and fear and humiliation, because that's how he experienced God. And so we see that played out. And if there's any compassion to be given, I think that that's the compassion that I give. To your point, I do think he is sincere. I think he creates a God of shame. I think we make God in our own image. And I think we see that with Warren.
Well, if religion is good for nothing else, then it is ascribing words to deep human emotions that evolved long before we had any words to ascribe to those. So yeah, and shame is an incredibly powerful controlling mechanism. So yeah, I agree.
And I think it's effective. To answer your question, do I think there's a logical end? Absolutely not. In fact, the work that I do is finding more and more and more startup groups. So when one group breaks up, at least 5 more start. It is so hard to keep up with. I find it hard to hold a good view of humanity sometimes, and even of Joseph Smith, because I see the fruits that I don't think anyone expected. I mean, I don't know if you've listened to my podcast, but I've had anywhere from, like psychedelic drug hippies who have their own group to people who follow the sort of remnant movement to, I was just down on the Bundy Ranch, and that was an interesting experience that I'm not ready to quite talk about yet. But the ways that we take this doctrine, there's something heady about this doctrine. It's not going to go away. It's not going to go away. I think what we need to work on in society in general is black and white thinking, fundamentalist thinking, and that is the best we can do to help people combat these sometimes dangerous ideas, because to me, polygamy is not the problem. Patriarchy is a problem, but I think black and white thinking is where it starts. And I try to, in my work, disrupt that constantly, because we all do it. I do it sometimes too, but that is what engenders fundamentalism. And so we are going to continue to see groups, and we just had an Amber Alert in Utah this last week where a man kidnapped several young girls, and they were found in barrels in a shipping crate, and he had been sealed to them. One was as young as 4 years old. This is a guy that just recently broke off from another group and started his group called the Knights of the Crystal Blade. I mean, this stuff isn't going away. People are going to find ways to justify their own desires and use Mormonism to defend it.
One thing that I would just add into this is, as far as my own personal take on this, and that's all. This is all that I will add into my own personal preference. I live up here in Seattle, this, incredible liberal bastion of progressive thinking. And, I do have a number of friends who are in, poly relationships, and I don't find that to be any sort of problem. And I think it is really quite an eye-opening experience to associate with people who are in poly relationships, because it's, it fills three criteria: educated, consenting adults. And as long as you fill those three criteria, it's like, just, have fun and be safe. That's all that really, really matters. Unfortunately, there is the religious aspect to add into all of this that stigmatizes and creates this certain power dynamic that I can't agree with. But I do personally think that we are kind of in the need, or maybe we're even in the transition phase of kind of having a bit of a relationship revolution in our society today. And it may take a few hundred years for it to actually take a foothold and change fundamentally. But I do hold out hope that we eventually will get to a time where polygamy is just one of many relationship dynamics that people choose, and polygyny or polyandry are just one way that's, people choose to have relationships, and that it doesn't hold this stigma to it. But I also think that there shouldn't be the religious power dynamic that is included in this. And that is, and unfortunately, there's really no way to separate that out from itself.
Well, I think to your point, I mean, from my experience with polyamory and seeing people who are polyamorous, what it does is being polyamorous actually, I think being in any poly relationship breaks down the black and white thinking. So it might sound counterintuitive,
Totally.
But women who live polygamy and men that live polygamy actually can practice these sort of nuances in the gray. And I think that that's the tool that sometimes fundamentalism can give people in polygamy. And that's a tool that helps them when they're trying to decipher the outside world, especially when they leave their group. So I actually think that, again, these relationships are not the problem. I think it's the black and white thinking. You call it religious thinking, which I think is true, but I would define religious thinking as black and white thinking, just because I've seen so many iterations of Mormonism that some of them would be unrecognizable as Mormon, and yet I can still see the roots. But one thing that I see consistently is, black and white magical thinking, and I think, to me, that is the most dangerous thing that humanity has.
Very well said. So let me just throw this back to you. Are there any final thoughts that you'd like to leave us with today?
Gosh, I don't know. This is a great interview. I would just, try to encourage people to learn more about these groups. And what I always say is, if you are driving through Arizona or Utah and you happen by Short Creek, please go in the town. It is not scary. Put your money in the town, eat it. There are several restaurants there. I'm going to recommend two to you. Of course, everyone knows the Merry Wives Cafe, which is run by Centennial Park, and it's really delicious food. The thing about people down there is they know how to cook really good.
Yeah, awesome.
And then the Barry Knoll Bakery, which is run by another family in Centennial Park. It's actually a young woman entrepreneur, and it's really, really amazing. And so there's that, and then there's the homespun market that gives, ice cream cones that are really cheap, and just go put your money into town. There's a dollar store there that you can buy stuff for your kids. There's a grocery store on the way to Arizona called Bees Marketplace, which is a Centennial Park store. Go and integrate with these people. I don't know if the dairy store has been evicted yet, the FLDS dairy store, but if not, go in the FLDS dairy store and buy from them as well.
Awesome. For this upcoming Christmas vacation, I actually hope to be down in the area, and I might have to swing down there and check the place out and give them some of my my infidel money. But of course, Lindsay, I used a lot of your podcast in order to compile the list today, and I'm going to leave links to a few episodes of your show of your polygamy in the show notes. And I strongly encourage people. I can't imagine there's anyone listening to my show who hasn't already gone through the entire Year of Polygamy backlog. But if you haven't listened to Year of Polygamy, please do so, and particularly listen to the episodes that I'm going to link up. And really, Lindsay, thank you for doing the work that you do, for bridging the gap between us, the outsiders out here who try and look in and study the fundamentalist groups from an intellectual perspective. And thank you for the work that you do, just everything that you do with Sunstone particularly. Just thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Bryce. Thanks for always being a friend and supporter.
Absolutely. And we'll hope to have you on in the future. Thanks for joining us.
I'm Ryan McKnight, and welcome to the Mormon Leaks Minute.
So many answers and assurances can come through daily searching and studying the scriptures, and with sincere and pleading prayer. But there are no such promises on the internet.
It has been quite some time since we've had on Ryan McKnight of the Truth and Transparency Foundation, which operates Mormon Leaks and faithleaks.io. Ryan, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Bryce. Thanks for having me again. I know it's been a while.
It has, and you have been incredibly busy. I have only, of course, been tracking Mormon Leaks, as it's kind of my foray, but wow, you sure don't let up.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I guess I'm a glutton for punishment, some would say.
Well, I want to dive right in because I know we don't have a whole lot of time with you today. You released an incredibly fascinating leak on the day that Donald Trump was landing in Utah to meet with Orrin Hatch, and I guess he didn't hold a rally there, but he was just visiting Utah to open up some areas that were previously National Preserve lands. Do you mind telling us a little bit about that leak?
Yeah, well, I mean, you kind of recapped it there. I mean, it's it's screenshots of the temple ordinances. Now, to be more specific, if you look at the records for his grandparents, you can actually see when the dates and the places where the ordinances took place. They were, so for example, for his grandfather, Friedrich Trump, he was baptized in 2015 in the Philippines. He was confirmed in 2015 in Las Vegas. He was initiatoried in Vegas same year, endowment in 2016, sealing in 2017, sealing to spouse in 2016. So you can see those dates and locations for him, for the grandparents. And then when it comes to the parents, you can see that there is a record, but when you look under all those different categories, it shows, I think it says record unavailable or something like that. And what we're told is, from various different people that we've spoken to that are familiar with the family search program, is that, frequently when there are either famous people or relatives of famous people, when they get caught, they get reviewed from time to time through, whoever it is, that's their job at church office building. And their records will be made private. And I think you have to have you have to establish that you're like a direct relative to be able to see when the work was done and stuff like that. I mean, that's what we're told.
Wow.
I suppose it's possible that their names are just in here. I don't think it's possible that their work was not done. That's my understanding, is that the fact that this exists and it shows the ordinance and it shows that the status is not available, it's because of the sort of connection they have to a famous person. And it's not just Trump. Like, if you go and look up, there's a ton of famous people that I've been made aware of since then. I'm trying to think of some of them off the top of my head, but there are a number of famous people whose work has been done for them. And if you have a family search, username and password, you can look them up, and it's very possible it will say not available because of who they are. But some of them, they haven't been made not available, so you can also go and look up a bunch of famous people and see their work.
I absolutely love this. So just a little bit of foundational work for anyone who is not familiar with Mormon ordinances and what they are, kind of what we're talking about here. Mormons practice what's called, ordinances for the dead, or, baptisms and conversions and endowments for dead people. Basically, they have people stand in their place by proxy in the temple and perform various ordinances. And then the theology behind this is that Mormons, or people who died without being told about Mormonism, they go to eternal Sunday school, essentially. And then once their ordinances are performed for them on earth by people by proxy, that's when they can accept those ordinances and go up to the terrestrial kingdom. So that the very foundation of this, it can obviously ruffle some feathers, because it's basically the last stand that Mormons make, saying, well, we know that we're right, and we're so certain that we're right that we're going to convert everybody to Mormonism posthumously, and it's up to them to decide in the afterlife whether or not they want to actually convert. So they're given the autonomy whether they want to accept or deny the ordinances. But if you're staring Mormon God in the face, you're probably not going to deny the usefulness of this ordinance, or, just reject it. And right. The church has gotten into trouble before with this. Famously, when they were baptizing Holocaust victims, there was this massive lawsuit that came out because apparently dead Jews did not want to be called Mormons, being, persecuted for their faith and whatnot. So I just love this, that, right when Donald Trump is making a land in Utah, this is when Mormon Leaks decides to put this information out there. That was brilliant.
You think we were sort of like waiting in the wings for this to happen, and like we wanted to
I'm just
pounce
saying,
on this opportunity, and which is what everybody's been accusing us of online, that we were trying to be opportunistic, but which I get. I do want to say, though, to your point about people being upset about these, I think it's important to note that the majority of Mormons, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, do not fully understand how offensive it is to baptize somebody for the dead, especially when there is no direct family tie. Now, some Mormons, they always want to react in an extreme fashion. And when you voice sort of this concern about, the icky feeling that one gets with this, they think that, you're suggesting that they must stop doing it. And I suppose that a lot of people would be happy if they stopped doing it. But the reality is there's, you can't stop them from doing it. They're within their rights, I suppose, to do it, even with the agreement that they arrived at with leaders in the Jewish community. I mean, that's really just a verbal, agreement. There's no sort of legally binding agreement for them to not baptize Holocaust victims anymore. And in fact, Holocaust victims are still being baptized. But I do think, and this is, I gave an interview on one of the news channels there in Utah when this came out, and they kind of said, well, what is it that Mormon Leaks wants, when in terms of transparency here? And I think really simply it would be that all of this information that we released is something that any member of the church can access with their username and password to Family Search. And I think for us, and I don't think this is unreasonable, we would just simply say that the church has a responsibility to make the information on Family Search available to everybody, so that a person can go and look up their relatives and see if there's been work done. And if there has, they can choose to react, offended, or they can say they don't care or whatever. But, the secrecy behind it, I think, exacerbates the problem.
And yeah, I mean, it's more this commitment to transparency and trying to, kind of force the church's hand in being transparent in situations like this. And maybe people don't want to be baptized for the dead. Maybe Donald Trump is happy being some sort of version of Christian, whatever he is, and his parents are happy with that, and they don't want to be baptized Mormon. I think it's just more pointing out, hey, this information should be out there and available to everybody, and maybe the church should exercise a little bit of discretion in who they choose to baptize.
Well, the problem with that is the way the system is currently set up. There's really no way to prevent people from baptizing certain people. Okay. It ultimately, there's a few safeguards in place, right? If you look at the comments surrounding the various articles that are written about this, you'll see a bunch of Mormons commenting saying, oh no, the church has protections in place for this kind of thing not to happen. Well, the reality is they obviously don't, because 4 people with no connection to Mormonism have had their work done. No direct connection anyway. I mean, I suppose if we want to say third, fourth cousin, I'm sure there's probably a Mormon out there that you could find, but I doubt that they live in the Philippines, which is where the original baptism for the grandparents occurred. So, the point is that they do have some safeguards in place to try to prevent things like Holocaust victims from being baptized, or people like Trump's parents from being baptized in the Philippines. But, at what it ultimately comes down to is an honor system. And it really is nothing more than that. There's a radio button that you have to click that basically says, I certify that this person, is somehow related to me, or I have received verbal permission from the family. Well, I'm not going to believe that the Trump family gave verbal permission to somebody in the Philippines to baptize the grandparents. I mean, I think it would be completely unreasonable to assume that. If Trump would like to come out and correct the record, then that's fine. But obviously these people in the Philippines in 2015, these safeguards existed, and they got through the safeguards. And, this is the case for a lot of people that are, Holocaust victims are still being baptized. There's somebody that's doing some work on that. It's probably not going to get published through Mormon Leaks, but it will come out probably in the next couple of months to show that the church has really done very little to nothing to try to curb that trend. So a lot of it is just, to me, it's a lot of a lot of song and dance, a lot of save face type of rhetoric, saying that, and I guess I do sympathize with them a little bit, because, what are they supposed to do? They, there's millions of people around the world doing this type of work. They cannot go, and the only way they could go and really shut it down would be to centralize the approval process of names. But the problem is that would then stifle any kind of progress that somebody may want when doing legitimate family names. That they've got to wait, 6 weeks for it to come back approved from Salt Lake City, type of a thing. And that's going to create its own problem within itself. So I'm actually okay saying that it's unreasonable to expect the church to avoid these types of baptisms. I don't think it's reasonable to expect them to prevent them from happening. And I think that the more reasonable solution is for them to just make the database available to the public and let the public react however it is they want. Stop hiding behind it. Stop acting like it's not a big deal. Stop acting like people don't care, and all that kind of stuff.
Agreed. I think that's a fantastic takeaway. There was also another leak that I really wanted to discuss with you. And this one, I think, this made a little bit more waves in particularly the ex-Mormon community, because, the church has, they've had certain stances on homosexuality and the LGBTQ community for quite some time. And there was this 1981 pamphlet that Mormon Leaks released, in talking about homosexuality, and basically directed to church leaders and how they should deal with it. Or do you mind discussing this a little bit as well, or, kind of prefacing the conversation for us?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm going to say, and this is me, Ryan McKnight here, this, I believe, is one of our most significant leaks. And it's probably not for the reasons why people would assume when they first hear me say that. This is not a leak that's necessarily brand new information, right? I mean, maybe we've never read this manual before, but I think most of us could have assumed that a manual like this existed if we were asked, right? Yeah. So in that sense, it's not necessarily revelatory, but, we have all seen a trend over the last 20 years, of the church slowly shifting their position on homosexuality and LGBTQ issues, which is, I suppose, a good thing. Right. But as part of that shift, they have tried to conveniently forget what was happening in the past. And what you have is you have a segment of the population that is either so young that they don't realize that the church was ever, had these kind of views on homosexuality, or they're in such denial, or, maybe they're just blatantly denying it, or, whatever the case may be. And a leak like this, I think is important for preserving the historical record. And I think it's important to recognize that the church, probably officially anyway, doesn't subscribe to most of what's in this manual, even if maybe some old school members do.
No, I'm sorry. I have to viciously oppose what you just said.
No, that's fine. And I think there's a debate to be had there.
No. Let me just discuss this for just a second.
Okay.
Because I just now finished reading through this pamphlet, and there is almost nothing that I found in this pamphlet that is in any way opposed to the church's modern stance on homosexuality. Okay. Yeah. This is in the first chapter, in the overview of homosexuality, subsection A. It says, quote, the First Presidency has issued the following statement to priesthood leaders. And this is quoting the statement. As we have previously stated, homosexuality is a sin in the same degree as adultery and fornication. Powerful forces are seeking to establish this sinful practice as an acceptable way of life. Homosexuality in men and women runs counter to divine objectives and is intended, and the intended destiny of mankind. The Lord has declared, and then it cites Moses 139, some claim homosexuality is incurable, therefore they seek to be considered a legitimate minority group protected by law. We should not be deceived by these false rationalizations. We must never lose our perspective amidst the world's clamor to justify and normalize immorality. According to the Lord's revealed word, the only acceptable sexual relationship occurs within the family between a husband and a wife. End quote. So my takeaway from that is the church still does not recognize that homosexuality is a legitimate thing, or that being gay is a legitimate thing. They can say you have same-sex attraction, but as long as you don't practice or act on it, then it's like David Bednar in that speech in 2016 says there are no homosexual members of the church, saying that they have free agency and autonomy to choose what they do with their same-sex attraction. So they still do not agree that homosexuality is a thing. And in subsection B of that same one, it says professionals do not agree on the causes of homosexual behavior. In the 1980s, there was plenty of research being done. There's still plenty of research being done as to the causes and effects of homosexuality and the gene expressions, which are frequently attributed to gay tendencies. And it is a combination of nature and nurture. I would think that most professionals agree on the broader reasons why somebody leans towards homosexuality as opposed to heterosexuality. But they just do not buy into the science. They don't think that science is a thing, apparently.
Okay, well, look, I don't explicitly disagree with anything you're saying, but I would push back a little bit. Because, like, I totally get it. I get what you're saying. I know Mormons that today would agree with everything written in this manual. And I would say that the teachings that I received as a teenager in the 90s revolving around homosexuality definitely had every single element that this manual had in it. So the manual was influencing the teachings of homosexuality, up into the 90s and possibly even to a certain extent today. I also agree that people like David Bednar and Dallin Oaks and, these extreme throwbacks that there are in leadership probably agree privately more with this manual than they don't agree with it. Having said that, I do think it is important to point out that if you want to seek out sort of, official printed church material, and we want to try to, quantify some certain progress. If you look at mormonandgay.org, which would be the church's equivalent to this manual in today's modern world, I think that they will draw a distinction that doesn't exist in this manual, and that is a distinction between being gay or being part of the LGBT community and then acting on it. Now, I'm not saying that that's a good thing. Obviously, this idea that it's okay to be gay but not act on it is a horrible thing. So I'm not trying to say that, kudos to them for doing that. But I would say that it's at least a step in the right direction from a manual like this. Now, the step is going in way too much of a slow motion.
Yeah, it's a baby step when we need a giant step, leap.
But Absolutely. It is still a step from this manual. And I think, so for example, that quote that you gave in the very first line, it says, and we have previously stated homosexuality is a sin. I think today they would say homosexual behavior is a sin. And I think it's important to draw that distinction. I'm not saying they're right when they say that.
Hang on. Actually, I would also agree with that. And I would look at, this is section 3, subsection A4. It says avoid labeling. In many cases, the person is guilty of homosexual thoughts or acts, but is not deeply involved in the society of those steeped in homosexual activities. Be careful not to label people homosexual. This both discourages them and tends to make them feel that they cannot solve their problems. It is better to refer to their homosexual behavior than to call them a homosexual. And I think the modern equivalent of that is same-sex attraction versus being gay.
Right. And sort of Bednar saying, there's no gays in Mormonism, which essentially he's trying to say, let's not call ourselves, gay in Mormon, because that, I think he didn't say this, but I think the reason why they don't want that is because it normalizes the term. And it's like, oh yeah, he's gay and he's Mormon. There's no big deal. And then, the slippery slope they would be worried about would be that would then lead to say, well, why can't he get married to the person that he loves? Right.
Right.
So
exactly.
that's why they want to avoid these labels. But yeah, look, this manual, there is no redeeming quality in this manual.
No.
And you can definitely point out tons and tons of parallels where you could say they are using this exact same rhetoric today. But I will say they have taken a half step forward. I think in regards to the reparative therapy.
I really got to talk on that, but I want to, I really quickly, I want to mention that they were obviously dealing with the impacts of people repressing their homosexual tendencies. Because right here it says, provide hope for the despairing. It says, there are many who have overcome the problem of homosexuality, inserted there, through repentance, prayer, and diligent program of self-mastery and the concern of others. Reach out to those struggling with this problem. They need your inspired guidance and counsel. And then it goes on to say, despair prompts feelings of hopelessness, and hopelessness, combined with the burden of unresolved sin and guilt, may lead an individual to contemplate or attempt suicide. And we see that still playing itself out in, Utah suicide statistics, especially for LGBTQ teens. Like, they were dealing with the same problems in the 1980s, and this pamphlet didn't solve any of them. It just, I would argue that it made them worse because it structured their homophobia.
Well, and it also, because in this manual, it seems like they're sort of laying the blame of this suicide at the feet of these people not being able to overcome their homosexuality, as opposed to the constant attempts to change them. It's like they're saying, if we don't change them, if we don't get the spirit in them, then they could end up committing suicide, as opposed to saying, maybe we should be more accepting so that they don't have thoughts of suicide. It's kind of a backwards take. But look, listen, we can point out horrible leaders today. There's no shortage of them, all the way up to the very top, that probably still say things that are just as damaging that are in this manual. But I do think it's important to recognize that as a whole, I do think that the leadership has made an attempt to go away from this type of rhetoric, and they've replaced it with something along the lines of, look, if you're gay, it's okay. We still want you to come. We don't want you to say you're not gay. But you can't ever get married. You can't ever, act on it or whatever. But I think that, this idea that, you can come to church, not hide the fact that you're gay and that you believe in the church. You couldn't do that, in the 90s and the 80s in most places. And I think, maybe. You might not be able to do that everywhere right now, but you can do it in more places today than you could before.
Yeah, but the way that I kind of approach this whole thing is like, this is an institutionalized problem. And the fact that they are stomping the LGBTQ community down with slippers today instead of with steel-toed boots doesn't redeem them from the fact that they are still stomping them down.
Wholeheartedly agree.
And also, like, it does, in the pamphlet, it talks about reparative therapy extensively, talking about using outside counsel groups and everything. And then, in 1989, Evergreen International was founded as a 501c3 nonprofit organization in Salt Lake City, and they are a gay reparative therapy group that exists today under the National Association for Research and Therapy of Homosexuality, which, historically they have been using shock therapy and incredibly damaging, psychologically traumatic methods in order to try and quote unquote cure people of their homosexuality. And the Evergreen Institute still exists under a different name, led largely by LDS people who have, let's just say they claim to have been cured of their homosexual tendencies, which is just a feedback loop. It's a self-perpetuating, damaging cycle, and it's just bringing more and more people into loathing themselves and their own nature and nurture. It's the whole thing is cancerous. Everything about it is disgusting.
There is a friend of mine from high school, and I haven't much seen him since high school. I may have seen him one time after high school, a long, long time ago. But our families were pretty close back in the day, and I've kept semi in touch with him on Facebook. And his dad is a pretty high up, prominent leader in the church. I don't really want to say who it is, but it's somebody who is high up. Okay, and he is openly gay and a believer. This friend of mine, and he's not constantly talking about it or putting it out there, but he will occasionally make posts on Facebook about it when in appropriate settings and discuss the fact that he's a believer and he's gay, and he's chosen sort of this path of being gay but not acting on it. Okay, so he's chosen sort of this life of celibacy, and I don't believe he's seeking out a mixed orientation marriage or anything like that. And he's sometimes over the past year or so commented on some of the different threads that have been around some of our leaks that touch on LGBT issues. And a lot of times his comments, really exude this undertone, and sometimes they're explicit in the fact that he really feels like he's damaged and he's extremely flawed for being a homosexual, and that this is sort of the cross he's been, given to bear in this life, and that he has to fight against this. And I respect him in the sense that, he's a grown man in his 30s who can choose to live his life however he wants. But at the same time, it's hard to not sort of feel bad for him that, he's so seeped in this, mindset that there's at least a little bit of self-hate there. It might not be as bad as some of the worst cases, but it's enough to where it shows in some of his comments, and it makes me sad, really. I don't know what else to say about that, but it's, the church, deserves very few, pats on the back for, their progress, other than to just sort of note the progress. But they are still one of the worst organizations when it comes to dealing with LGBTQ issues, and it's definitely important to continue to point that out.
Absolutely. And I think we're seeing a similar tendency when it comes to the church's progressiveness and them being held back by the gerontocracy, which leads the church. And that seems to be exhibiting itself with LGBTQ rights right now. And I think on a personal level, this is my own personal opinion. I'm sure you or other people may take issue with this, but I think the church deserves nothing but condemnation on how slow they have been to react to societal pressures that have been pushing them to be more progressive. But I think that's a whole other issue that we can't dive into here. So Ryan, we are going to continue over on the Patreon side and talk about an op-ed piece that you and Ethan released. So if you want to support the show and gain access to extra content, please do so by going to patreon.com/nakedmormonism, and you'll find the Patreon edition of this episode with the extra interview where Ryan and I talk about this op-ed piece. But for today, thank you so much for joining me, Ryan.
Yeah, and thank you for having me.
All right, that's going to do it for the content of today's episode. At the end of the interview with Ryan, the Mormon Leaks Minute, I did say that you'll find this episode is longer because we talk about that op-ed through the Salt Lake Tribune. Instead, that ended up being a bit of a longer conversation than expected, so that is released as a standalone conversation for Patreon subscribers at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. If you want to gain access to that extra content, as well as a plethora of other special extra content for people who support the show, you can do so by pledging to support at patreon.com for as little as $1 an episode. And we've had a bit of an upset with the Patreon pledges and some edits, and it's been kind of confusing. So I'm just going to go through the new pledges and the pledge edits, and I know a number of these pledge edits have been made in response to Patreon attempting to change how they charge patrons and then, backing away from that decision as well. But I'm just going to list them here, and if I miss anybody, any new pledges or any pledge edits, please send me a message and I'll rectify that next episode. So thank you so much to George Green for the pledge edit. He did send me a message to say that he's editing and he will be still pledging the same dollar amount per month, but it does show a massive increase. So thank you for that pledge edit, George. We also have a pledge by Adam Gonerman, who you'll remember from way, way back in the good old days when he came onto the show to talk about Campbellism. I think you'll find that back in episode like 16 or something like that. We also had a pledge edit by Daniel McDougall and Frank Aponte, Levi Clausen, and Jeff Peterson. So thank you for all those pledge edits. And then we had brand new pledges by Brian Stink Vomit. Yes, it's weird to get an email saying you received a pledge from Stink Vomit. And also Daryl Ross. So to all of the new patrons, the new NAMO Juvenile Delinquent, Adolescent Rebels, and Apostates, thank you all of those new pledges and for all the pledge edits and for everybody who has decided to stick with us through the changes that Patreon is making. Thank you so much for your continuing support and keeping this show up and running and funding the research that is going into this. It is deeply, deeply appreciated. All right, that is pretty much going to do it. Next week, we have another interview planned, and this is actually a very special interview. You heard Lindsay tease it when she was in the interview today. She made reference to an interview that I conducted with Roy Jeffs, who is a son of the infamous Warren Jeffs, who I certainly take personal issue with if you listen to last episode. But Roy Jeffs' interview is going to be aired next week. I'm trying to decide whether to split that up into two separate episodes because it was a bit of a longer interview, or if it's just going to be a single standalone episode. Still kind of working out the details on that. So next week is going to be a very interesting and special interview with Roy Jeffs, and I hope you look forward to it just as much as I do. With that, I have to thank the people who keep this show running on the back end. I'll start off by thanking Julie. She is our social media guru. She runs the Twitter and Facebook handles. Thank you so much, Julie. Be sure to give her a follow at TheRealEmmaHale. Thank you to Jason Camo of ALostStateOfMind.com for making the music, this beautiful music going into your ears right now that's used with his permission. Thank you so much to Andrew Torres of the Opening Arguments podcast and the law offices of P. Andrew Torres for providing legal counsel for this show. Thank you so much once again to all the patrons who support the show monetarily. We really do appreciate it. And most of all, thank you to the wondiferously beautiful listeners out there once again for lending me your ear. I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism podcast. preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2017, all rights reserved.